Hello, my name's Tyler, and this honestly isn't the easiest story to tell. I was raised an only child with a single mother. We struggled quite a bit. Growing up, there were some heartbreaking challenges along the way. You see, life rarely prepares you for the unexpected. I'm still grappling with a shocking incident I recently faced at a homeless shelter. But before that, let's delve a bit into the past as I share a few of my most painful memories and how I managed to overcome some terrible things. Growing up, I was already slightly different. I was the only neighborhood child raised by a single mother. The kids kept to themselves and had their own exclusive circle. I never really fit in with them. Their parents would also look down on my mother and me, after all, who wanted to befriend a lonely child with a single struggling mother. I never knew much about my father, except that he'd abandoned us when I was a mere toddler. Things weren't always so difficult. My mother worked as a receptionist at the local bank and made enough to ensure I could afford toys, movies, and whatnot. It was only after the bank shut down that we became helpless. Unable to afford the endless home bills, my mother and I shifted to a smaller house in an even smaller neighborhood. Frankly, it made our last home seem like a mansion in comparison, but we had to make do with our circumstances. I never gave my mother a reason to complain, though. She'd found employment as a waitress by day and a janitor by night. Life was hard on her as it was, and the last thing I wanted to be was another burden for her. But this also meant I hid some of the worst years of my life from her. The worst years in question were my time at high school. My mother enrolled me in the neighborhood's public high school. She was adamant that I study and become a respectable figure in society. I never quite knew my passion or interest back then, but my mother wanted to make sure I was educated and independent. If only high school had been kinder, perhaps I wouldn't have to suffer the way I did. It was here where I first met Charlie, the man who effectively changed my life for the worse. I was nervous for my first day of school. My mother and I went shopping for school supplies the night before. I remember how expensive the supplies and the school fees had been for my mother, but she insisted that it didn't affect her at all. She often said, "Money is no object when it comes to you, Tyler." I couldn't have been more grateful to have her as a parent. Her resilience to keep working hard and managing my expenses along with her own needs was awe-inspiring. The next day, I finally arrived for the first day of school. It was an exciting atmosphere to see fresh new faces. Our new neighborhood hardly had any children at all, so seeing so many kids my age was a welcome surprise. I noticed some bullying in the halls, kids rushing for sports events, and groups of girls and boys laughing together. It seemed like a lively place to be, and I was genuinely keen about high school. But all my enthusiasm vanished after the first day itself. A disaster awaited me. As the lecture began, the teacher asked everyone to introduce themselves. I was sitting in the middle row and the kids in front went first. But there was a group of boys at the back of the classroom, teasing every person who introduced themselves. They giggled and made jokes about each person's name and even threw paper planes at the kids who were speaking. I turned around, and this is when I first laid eyes on Charlie. He was an obese and tall kid, clearly the ringleader of the boys' group at the back. The teacher tried several times to silence them, but they refused to listen. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I felt even more nervous than before. I went up to the front of the class and tried my best to speak up. "Hey everyone, my name's Tyler. I recently moved to the neighborhood and I'm excited to." My speech was cut short by an eraser being flung right into my eye. I took a moment to recover, and even the teacher was alarmed. The culprit was obvious, as Charlie and his group burst into laughter. However, the pain of the throw was so sharp that tears rolled down my eyes. Unfortunately, Charlie seized this moment. Hey, now look at him, folks. Not even a day and he already misses his mommy. The rest of the class started to laugh as well. I rushed out of the classroom, feeling humiliated and ashamed. I couldn't believe my first day of high school had already been met with misfortune. Little did I know that this one incident seemed like a drop of water compared to the storm that was to come. After class, I hastily decided to confront Charlie in front of his group. "Hey, you could have almost blinded me. You better not do that again." Charlie stepped towards me while the rest of his group smiled. I already sensed I was in trouble. We've got a fighter here, have we? I just wanted to talk it out, that's all. Sure, we can talk it out. Follow me. I had no idea where we were going, but I went along with Charlie and his group to an isolated science lab. Suddenly, one of the boys locked the door as the group cornered me and knocked me down to the floor. They began kicking me fiercely. I lost track of time. I had no idea whether it lasted a couple of seconds or minutes. A short while later, they backed away as Charlie gave me one final kick in the knee. Every inch of my body hurt. This is 1% of the torture you'll get if you ever talk back to me. Get that straight in your stupid head. He unlocked the door and rushed out with his group, leaving me alone on the floor of the lab. I picked myself up and somehow managed to pull through the rest of the day. I reached home in the afternoon and my mother wasn't at home. I bandaged some of the cuts and bruises myself. I couldn't believe this was how my first day of high school had gone. I became fearful of Charlie and his group. If this was the first day, who knows what else they had in store for all the years of high school. Turns out this wasn't even a fraction of the pain they would inflict upon me, and the worst was yet to come. Throughout the week, Charlie not only harassed me but also disrupted classes. He'd casually fling paper planes at the professor and toss small items at different students. I'd already been his target once and was afraid of being picked on again. Throughout the first week, I was shy and found it difficult to socialize with the kids in class. High school was rough, and some of the kids had already labeled me as the crying kid who wept on the first day of school. I was really hurt and felt increasingly out of place in an environment where I'd been eager to fit in. Home wasn't the best place either. It felt incredibly lonely since my mom worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and I was all alone. It was no fault of hers, just an unfortunate situation to be in. But there finally seemed to be a ray of hope in the first week of high school. While I received mixed reactions from the kids at school, and with Charlie and his gang terrorizing half the grade, I finally found someone kind and like-minded. His name was Logan, and he was a physically disabled child. He required a wheelchair at all times, but he always seemed like the jolliest person you'd meet. He'd lost his legs in a car accident when he was young, but he was remarkably strong. His humor and joy were infectious. We bonded over our shared love for music, and Logan pretty much became a close friend. He told me he'd been verbally abused by Charlie and his group, but he just shrugged it off. Logan often said, "Bitter people say bitter things. You can't take them to heart." I was amazed by how clear-headed and calm Logan was, never letting his condition or the cruelty of others get the better of him. Unfortunately, even the kindest souls have their limits tested by the most heartless beings. Sadly, this is exactly what happened in Logan and my situation. Logan had heard from a few people that Charlie turned into a ruthless bully after he was separated from his younger brother. Charlie was actually an orphan, and during his adoption, only he'd been taken away by his foster family, leaving his brother behind. It certainly explained a lot about Charlie's pent-up rage. Meanwhile, I sensed that Charlie was growing frustrated by my friendship with Logan. He seemed irked for some reason, unable to understand how Logan and I got along so well, and remained unbothered by him and his group. One weekend, I even introduced Logan to my mom, and she seemed pleased that I was socializing and had found a reliably good friend. But of course, in his usual fashion, Charlie decided to spell some trouble for Logan and me. It started with little things: stealing Logan's allowance money from his bag, purposely tripping me over in the hallways, and name-calling Logan and me in the cafeteria with all kinds of terrible slurs. While all of these were annoying, nothing compared to what Charlie had planned next. It changed everything forever. It had been a late day at school, and right before we left, Logan and I were collecting some of our stuff from the lockers. The hallway was mostly empty as all the kids were busy watching a soccer match outside. Neither Logan nor I were interested in sports, and we planned to head to the record store to check out new albums. Just as we were leaving, Charlie and his gang emerged from nowhere. There were a few kids in the hall who seemed terrified to see Charlie. He gave them a hard stare and then yelled, "Get out of here or else you all are next." The kids rushed out of the hall as fast as they could. I was confused and terrified. Logan tried to remain calm, but he was frightened too. "We don't want to break you guys up. We know why all are a beautiful couple. We're just friends, you idiot. Now get out of our way, Charlie." I was surprised at how fearlessly Logan stood up for both of us. He had nerves of steel. But we'd severely underestimated Charlie's rage that day. "Not so fast. Heard the two of you were talking about my brother. There's a price to be paid for that. Come with me." Charlie whistled, and in an instant, 2 members of his group took control of Logan's wheelchair. I jumped forward to protect him, but was restrained by 3 of Charlie's group members. They were taller, fiercer, and stronger. They held me back, while the other 2 threatened Logan. Charlie started walking ahead. "Get them this way, boys." He marched forward and led us all to an isolated stairwell at the back of the school. I had a horrible feeling about the whole situation. There was nobody here to help us. We were trapped and alone, at the mercy of violent bullies. Charlie instructed the two boys to hold Logan's wheelchair near the edge of the staircase. "What are you doing? That's too close. He's going to fall." I leapt forward to help him, but Charlie punched me. The three of his boys pinned me against a wall. I could barely breathe. I was able to catch a glimpse of Logan from the corner of my eye. For the first time, I saw true fear in his eyes. Both of us were paralyzed with fear, wondering what was going to happen next. Charlie sat on one of the steps and smiled a cold, twisted grin. "So aside from talking about my past, I noticed the two of you were skipping the soccer match. So I figured, while everyone else is enjoying the game outside, how about we play a sport of our own?" "What are you talking about?" Charlie gestured towards the boys who were holding me back. "Boys, let go of him, but guard the door. We can't let him escape." The three boys freed me, but I was still cornered. I turned to see Logan and felt my heart beating frighteningly fast. His wheelchair was very close to the edge of the stairs. "Now let's play a game called Who's the Best Animal? You, Tyler kid, you're up." "What? What do I have to do?" "Well, nothing much. You just have to dance like an animal of my choice. My first request is a chicken." He took out his phone and turned on a flashlight. The rest of the boys snickered. "Come on, chop chop. I'm recording this stuff. Listen, I don't feel so good." "Oh, really? Well, that's too bad. Because if you don't dance, your precious little friend gets pushed down the stairs and meets his little end." I was already afraid, but now I was terrified. Charlie had truly cornered us with no chance of escape. One of the boys holding Logan pushed his wheelchair an inch closer to the edge. Logan began whimpering and I was panic-stricken. Charlie laughed, watching the terror in our faces. He pressed the record button on his phone. "Come on, stop wasting my time. Let's dance, chicken." I hesitated for a few seconds. I was humiliated beyond belief, but at the same time, Logan's life was at stake. Nothing could be risked at this moment. Slowly and uncomfortably, I started dancing while imitating a chicken. Charlie and his group roared with laughter. Tears streamed down my eyes as I danced for more than 7 entire minutes. It felt endless. Once I was tired, I begged him to stop. "Come on, now do a pig. Squeal for us. Charlie, please stop this." Charlie suddenly stood up and walked over to Logan. He held his hand over the wheelchair with an evil look in his eye. "Come on, Tyler. Oink to save your friend. Come on, piggy." Already embarrassed but desperate to ensure Logan's safety, I began imitating a pig. Charlie kept laughing and his entire group recorded my dance. 5 exhausting minutes later, I stopped. My face was full of sweat and tears. I was red with shame. Charlie grinned. "Good job, piggy." But I wasn't impressed enough. "Get him, boys." Before I realized what was happening, the group furiously started to attack me, and Charlie pushed Logan's wheelchair down the steps. I heard crashing and screaming as Logan landed at the bottom of the stairs. And then silence. I was horrified and tried to fight back the boys, but it was useless. Charlie punched me hard. "Next time you talk about me or my family, I'll be pushing you next." Charlie and his group left me beaten on the floor and dashed out of the stairwell. I was left alone with Logan. Despite my injuries, I hurried down the flight of stairs and was horrified to see the wheelchair shattered and blood everywhere. Logan was unresponsive. Everything after that moment was a blur. I rushed out to alert a teacher. The news soon spread like wildfire as Logan was taken to the hospital and my wounds were treated in the school's first aid room. All the students rushed to see what had happened, but Charlie and his group vanished into thin air. The next few weeks that followed were hectic and nightmarish, to say the least. Logan's parents filed a lawsuit against the high school for failing to protect their son. Logan remained in an unresponsive state throughout. I identified Charlie and his group as the culprits behind Logan's fall. But as fate would have it, I was helpless. Charlie's group all had extremely rich and influential parents, and Charlie's foster parents were the most powerful among them all. Even the principal was swayed by them. To make matters worse, Logan stayed unresponsive and couldn't testify about the events of that day. My mother was summoned to the school and she argued with Charlie's parents and defended me. But we stood no chance against their sheer power. Eventually, Logan's parents became frustrated and withdrew his admission from the high school. I visited Logan a couple of times while he was still bedridden. But one night, I received a heartbreaking surprise when I reached the hospital. Logan and his family had left town and moved to another place. That was the last time I ever heard about Logan. It broke my heart at the state of things, and I was filled with all the more rage. But Charlie's bullying never stopped. His group was smart enough never to leak my embarrassing videos, as it would be proof that they were present the day Logan fell. However, Charlie continued to hold it over me as leverage, and with Logan gone too, I lost all hope. Even if the video came out now, with Charlie's influence and Logan out of the picture, there was nothing I could do. Suddenly, I was back to square one at high school all alone. None of the other kids approached me after what happened to Logan, and somehow Charlie and his group even planted rumors that I was responsible for his fall. I was sickened by how low Charlie could sink, but his bullying tactics knew no bounds. I assumed after everything, Charlie and his group would leave me alone, but that was far from the truth. I didn't want any more trouble after Logan, and after my mother had been called to the school once, she'd been worried sick about how I was managing. I was afraid of worrying her anymore. But another, horrific incident occurred a month later. I was sitting alone in the cafeteria when I saw Charlie and his group walking towards me. I was immediately tense and wondered what they wanted. Charlie placed a blank piece of paper in front of me and handed me a pen. "Put your name and signature at the bottom of the page." "Why? What's this?" "Just do it." "Look, I don't want any trouble, Charlie. Could you please leave me alone?" Sure, if that's what you want. It'd be nice to refresh the memory of our classmates though, wouldn't it?" "What do you mean?" "Well, if you're not going to sign it, perhaps it's time to show the world what a good little piggy you were." "You wouldn't do that." "Come on, Tyler. Do you really think there's anything I wouldn't do at this point? The real question is how much more I can do if you don't sign that paper." Afraid of his threats of violence and humiliation, I quietly signed the paper. Charlie and his group snatched it once I was done and thankfully left me alone. At the time, however, I had no idea that I'd basically committed one of the worst mistakes of my entire life. Later that day, as our teacher arrived for the final lecture, she saw a piece of paper at her desk. Her face went cold and I felt my stomach churning. It was the same paper Charlie had made me sign. The teacher began yelling at me and ordered me to visit the principal's office. I felt deeply ashamed and worried. What had Charlie and his group done now? I waited patiently in the principal's office, but my mind was riddled with anxiety. I kept wondering what was in that paper. Suddenly, my mother walked into the office and I was alarmed. "Mom, Tyler, what have you done now?" She seemed quite disappointed as she took a seat. My heart sank to see her so worried and let down by me. The principal started speaking. "Ma'am, your son left a piece of paper by a teacher's desk this afternoon. It's filled with some of the most obscene, sick, and abusive language I've ever seen. He's written ugly things about every single person in his class, including his teacher. And he's proudly signed it at the bottom of the sheet." "I never did that. It was Charlie." "Please don't interrupt me. And frankly, I'm tired of this Charlie excuse every time, Tyler. Logan's case was a horrific one and we gave you the benefit of the doubt. But this simply crosses the line. I'm afraid I have no other choice but to expel you from this institution." And just like that, life had stabbed me in the back not once, but twice. My mother and I protested my innocence, but nothing could save me from a letter where my name and signature were explicitly written in ink. I was finished. I walked out of high school, devastated, my mother even more so. The bus ride home was one of the most tragic conversations I'd ever had with my mother. "I don't know what I'm going to do now, Tyler. I spent all my savings sending you to this school. How did this happen? Oh God, what are we going to do?" I remember how powerless and scared I felt at that moment. I wondered what our future looked like now. That night, my mother asked me to wait in the living room while she finished some work in my bedroom. I didn't ask any questions and patiently waited for her. She came downstairs a few hours later with all my clothes, toys, and items packed in a suitcase. It was everything I ever owned. "Come with me, Tyler." "Mom, what are you doing? Where are we going?" "Don't ask too many questions. Come along now." I was distressed by what was happening. Was she abandoning me? Were we going somewhere? A million thoughts flooded my mind as my mother loaded my luggage onto the bus, and we got off a few miles later. My mother walked towards a random house in a neighborhood I'd never seen before. I followed her blindly, my head filled with fear and one question after another. She rang the doorbell and a tall, heavy man answered the door. He looked surprised. My mother stared at him desperately. "Keith, you know I'd never ask you a favor unless it was life or death. But I really need something." "Abigail, what's the matter? Come on inside." We entered the man's house and my mother and him spoke in whispers for an entire hour. I had no clue they were discussing my very future there and then. I only heard snippets of whatever they were talking about. "Please, I'm begging you. I know he's your son, but I can't take care of a mother and her child. You think I'm single by choice? I can't afford much, Abigail. Don't worry about me, just take him in, please. I'd never ask if it wasn't this bad. I got kicked out of waitressing today. Help me out here." There was some more whispering until my mother finally walked over to me. She gave me a tight hug and a forehead kiss and flashed her iconic smile. "Tyler, this is my best friend Keith. I've known him for 20 years now. You're going to be staying with him for a while." "What? Mom, why? I just met him. Where are you going?" "Listen, don't worry so much, Tyler. I'll be back before you know it. Keith here is going to take care of you. We're going to be all right, Tyler, I promise." As my mother walked out the door that night, I felt as though my life had been destroyed. I was stuck living with a man I barely knew and my mother had simply left without an explanation. Heartbreakingly enough, I had no idea this was my final farewell and the last time I'd ever see my mother. Keith tucked me into bed that night and tried consoling me the best he could. He explained to me that my mother was going through a very difficult time and had been laid off. She could barely afford to keep our house running, let alone take care of me. Keith assured me that she'd be back one day when things improved. Neither of us would ever be prepared for the future shock, however. As for living with Keith, I slowly learned to trust him over time. He wasn't so bad. He was quite intelligent and decided to homeschool me. In return, he'd enlist my help at his car wash place. It was a small establishment, but Keith needed all hands on deck, and I was more than happy to do my part. I diligently worked at the car wash for a few hours in the day, while Keith made a comfortable life for me at his house and dedicatedly homeschooled me. I sorely missed my mother and there were times when the feeling was unbearable, but Keith would patiently assure me of her return each time. But right when things finally showed promise, I was once again thrust into a nightmarish situation. I was working at the car wash over the weekend. My shift was almost up. Just then a couple of luxury cars drove into the car wash. I was amazed by them. But as the car windows rolled down, my face turned to one of horror. "Hey there, Piggy. Heard you're working here." I felt my blood running cold. I thought I'd left him and everything that had occurred in the past. But yet, here Charlie was again. I looked around for help, but Keith was away for some bank work, and the few employees who had shifts after mine were yet to show up. "Come on, I've got 4 cars here, chop chop." I felt disgusted, scared, and angry all at once. I wanted to run away at that moment, but I couldn't. Charlie and his gang had come along with their chauffeurs, and they kept snickering and passing rude remarks. "Get a good look at these cars. You probably couldn't afford one of these in 2 lifetimes." Once all of them were done with the car wash, Charlie stepped out of the car to stretch his legs. He walked around the place and examined everything. "Makes sense you'd be working at such a dump. By the way, I saw your hobo mom last week while I was driving upstate. She's out begging on the streets, if you can believe it. When is it your turn? What are you talking about?" My mind started spinning. Did he call my mother a hobo? Was she actually homeless? Did she lie to me? Was she never coming back? I felt a headache coming. I could barely make sense of what was going on. Charlie and his group chuckled as he walked over to me. "You didn't know, huh? Well, I suggest you join her soon." The group laughed some more as Charlie sat back in his car. "Now that we know where to find you, we'll keep coming back to meet you. That is until you're not out on the streets like your mom." All of them continued laughing and drove away in their luxury cars. I cried as the group left the car wash. Later that day, I returned home and waited for Keith. He reached home in the evening and was surprised to see me sitting silently. "Hey, Ty. Is everything okay?" I struggled to get the next words out of my mouth. "Keith, why didn't you tell me the truth?" "What truth? Is Mom homeless? Does she have nowhere to go?" Keith's stunned face gave it away. Clearly, he didn't expect me to discover this startling piece of information. He sighed and finally sat next to me. "I never told you anything because your mother never wanted me to. I can barely afford to stay here, Tyler, but I took you in because I owed your mother. 20 years ago, she saved my life. I'd been mugged, attacked, and left for dead. Your mother found me and took me to the nearest hospital. I was minutes away from death, and it was a miracle I survived. We became best friends after that. I told her I owed her a life-changing favor. And here you are." I was awestruck by this revelation. Never in 1,000 years could I have imagined Keith and my mother's bond ran so deep. This confession not only deepened my understanding of her but also strengthened the bond between Keith and me. Now that the truth was out there, I felt shattered and strange. I asked Keith if we could track her down, but he confessed that he had no idea where she was. I was crushed. As Keith tucked me into bed that night, I stayed up for a while, grappling with everything I'd heard that day. Unfortunately, the biggest tragedy of my life was yet to occur. A week later, the dreaded day arrived. Keith and I were working at the car wash when he received a phone call. It seemed quite serious. Without a word, Keith asked the other employees to take care of me while he came back. He wouldn't return until several hours later. I was done my shift at the car wash and I sitting at home, finishing up some assignments Keith had given me. Keith entered the house in the evening with the most solemn look. His face was red as if he'd wiped away tears. I felt a gut-wrenching feeling in my stomach. I wasn't remotely prepared for his next words. "Tyler, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I got a call from upstate. A hospital ID'd your mother. She passed away this morning." My mind instantly went numb. It's as if everything ceased to exist at that moment. I broke down as Keith tried consoling me, but I was hopeless. My only ray of hope had disappeared. I studied hard and worked even harder at the car wash, hoping to become educated and independent as my mother had always wanted. But she was gone now. Everything felt empty and meaningless. In a cruel twist of fate, she tried saving one of her friends from some armed attackers but died in the resulting conflict. Keith was devastated and even felt responsible for her death, stating that she'd saved him when he needed her the most and that he'd failed to save her in her time of need. But I assured him that he'd already been there in her time of need by taking me in. This eased his mind and he vowed to continue taking care of me for the rest of his life if it was needed. Months and whole years passed by, but my mother's demise continued to weigh heavy on my mind. However, ever since that tragic day, I'd been determined to honor her legacy. I'd been saved and taken in by Keith because of her act of selflessness all those years ago. She'd even died being selfless, and if I could come close to a fraction of her courage and resilience, I'd be happy. I decided to pursue medicine that day, eager to become a doctor. It was no easy task, and I buried myself in study books and medical journals, studying for hours on end. Keith was impressed by my progress. I kept working hard, and a few years later, I got into one of the biggest medical colleges through a scholarship. Although it was expensive for Keith, he gave me plenty of money for myself so I could buy anything I wanted at college. The experience with Charlie and the tragic event of my mother left me broken and at college. I was an isolated student, studying alone. I should have let loose a bit and enjoyed myself, but I was so determined to score well and make my mother proud that I hardly wasted any time. In my final year, however, I was able to unwind. I'd befriended a couple of students, and unlike high school, the students here were actually kind-hearted. I visited Keith during my breaks, and an unspoken bond developed between the two of us. He was like the father I never had. As college drew to an end, all my hard work paid off as I graduated with top honors. Keith was ecstatic and cheered louder than any of the parents present at the graduation ceremony. I couldn't be happier to have such a supportive figure in my life. I returned home with Keith and confessed to him that I had a rather odd plan for my future. I want to be part of a non-profit medical organization. What are you saying? I'm not joining a hospital or starting a clinic. I'll be touring the country, going from homeless shelters to orphanages, helping people. I wasn't sure how Keith would react, but he got emotional and gave me a tight hug. He couldn't stop smiling. "Abigail would be so damn proud of you, Ty." I was filled with happiness upon hearing those words. It was clear that it broke Keith's heart to see me go after all these years, but he hit it pretty well and chose the noble option of not standing in my way. He helped me pack my luggage, and the last words he said were, "Go change the world." That day, I left home feeling emotional but also charged with a newfound positivity. Keith's encouragement was all I needed to hear. I spent the next several years as part of a nonprofit organization, moving across state lines and helping those in need. Some of my peers were shocked as to why a doctor, who graduated with top honors, was carrying out nonprofit work, but I couldn't fully explain the real reason to anyone. It was all for my mother. I moved across orphanages and homeless shelters, treating those in dire circumstances free of charge. But one particular patient of mine was life-changing in more ways than one. I was working at a homeless shelter around my old high school. It felt strange being back in my town. The shelter had been struck by a natural disaster. Just as I finished up with a patient, an aged woman suddenly rushed towards me. She introduced herself as Ruth and begged me to save her son's life. I'd honestly never seen such desperation, and I instantly knew her son was critical. Ruth led me to her young son, Alan, who was lying against a wall. His legs were bleeding all over. He only whimpered, "Please do something, doctor." I examined Alan's legs and rushed him to an emergency tent. My colleague believed it would be extremely difficult to save his legs with our limited resources and suggested amputation. However, I insisted and argued with him that we could save the boy's life. Despite our disagreement, we got to work where my colleague and I operated on his legs. Ruth stood outside the tent, nervous about her son's fate. I don't know why I was so insistent on saving Alan. Perhaps it's because his condition and face reminded me of Logan. An 8-hour exhausting operation later, my colleague and I set aside our instruments. The boy had been saved. Ruth started crying and hugged both of us. We were just glad that the surgery was successful. Alan came to consciousness a few hours later, and I couldn't stop smiling. It was moments like these which reminded me why I loved this job. But one of the most mind-boggling twists in my life would come a year later. I toured across states for a year, taking care of many different patients across different shelters. A year later, I returned home to meet Keith. He was older now and had expanded his car wash into a bigger establishment. I was delighted by his success. I stayed with Keith during Christmas break, and while I was there, I decided to visit Ruth and Alan. One never forgets such patients, and I was eager to see how they'd been coping. I visited their homeless shelter with gifts and food and eagerly looked for them. A lot of charitable people were also at the shelter, distributing items during the holidays. As I looked for Ruth, I accidentally bumped into a tall man and his wife. They were giving out some free meals. As the man turned around, I received the shock of a lifetime. My face fell and I felt like an awkward and scared teenager all over again. Charlie. Charlie, now much older, stared at me curiously. His wife turned around as well. It took Charlie a minute to register who I was. His vicious smile came back instantly once he recognized me. No way. It's Piggy. In the flesh again. I don't know why I was so terrified after all those years. The trauma of Charlie's bullying, along with Logan's incident, was still fresh in my mind. Seeing him again only opened past wounds I never wished to revisit. Charlie laughed and introduced his wife to me. Sandra, this is Tyler. I've known this pig since high school. Hasn't changed one bit. Don't go close to him though, he probably stinks. I was shocked at Charlie's behavior even after all these years. You often expect people to change, reform, and mend their ways. But this man remained his wicked self. He shoved a meal box into my hand. I knew you'd end up homeless like your low-life mom. Now take this and share it with your hobo friends. Sandra giggled at Charlie's remark. He'd truly found a wife as despicable as he was. You're holding an awful lot of boxes already. You've been stealing extra tonight, huh? Charlie and his wife kept laughing at their crude comments. Before I could utter another word, Ruth suddenly emerged from nowhere. Who's this? Your hobo friend. Ruth didn't seem bothered at all by Charlie. Instead, she was excited to see me. Thank you for saving my son's life, Doc. Charlie's face turned cold. Did she just call you Doc? You're a doctor. He saved my son's life. He's the best. Sandra and Charlie were caught off guard by this revelation. Charlie's expression turned from one of confidence to frustration. As I handed Ruth some gifts, Charlie let out a cry. All of us turned around to see Charlie hugging Alan. Alan, what are you doing here? Ruth was confused and rushed to protect her son. Get away from him. Who are you? You don't understand, he's my brother. I was stunned. It couldn't be. Charlie's long-lost younger brother ended up at a homeless shelter right next to our high school, while Charlie himself lived a lavish life with his foster parents all these years. What were the odds? I couldn't help but smile at the randomness of fate. Alan hesitantly embraced Charlie after he understood that they were estranged brothers. Charlie started to cry, a sight I never thought I'd see. Come on, Alan. We're finally going home. To everyone's shock, Alan didn't budge. He hugged Ruth instead and turned to Charlie. I heard how you spoke to the doc here. Low-life mom, hobo friends. You disgust me, Charlie. This doc saved my life. I would have died if it weren't for him. Charlie was at a loss for words. He was torn between thanking me and dragging his brother home. Alan held onto Ruth's hand. "I love you, Charlie, but I'm happy here." "You don't understand. My foster parents are rich. They'll give you." "I don't care, Charlie. I found my mom. You better apologize to that doc and get out of here." "Alan, look, I'll give you whatever you want. Just come home. I wanted my legs. 4 doctors told me I'd be crippled for life. But this doc here fought for me. I've got my legs back and my mom. That's all I need." "Goodbye, Charlie." As Alan walked away with Ruth, Charlie turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Listen, please speak to him. Please change his mind, I beg you. Please forgive me." He grabbed my shoulders. The desperation was so evident. However, the only reaction that struck me in that moment was a simple smile. "No, I won't forgive you. Your brother would rather be in a homeless shelter than stay with you. That's gotta hurt. So why don't you go back home to your miserable life?" I walked away and gave one of Charlie's meals to a passing homeless man. I heard Charlie screaming in helplessness as I left. Finally, he was confronted with the consequences of all his past evils. I never imagined helping Alan would result in such a satisfying twist of fate. All I'd set out to do was honor my mother's legacy. But I suppose life does come back full circle, sometimes in the best ways.